Consider this crazy reality for a second. Today, getting behind the wheel, legally, requires jumping through massive bureaucratic hoops across the country. You have to memorize manuals, pass road tests, hand over cash, and carry government ID just to pilot a heavy metal machine down the freeway. We often assume it was always this strict, as if permits and regulations were invented on the exact same day as the automobile itself. In reality, during the early days of motoring in the US, absolute chaos reigned with zero tests, speed limits, or traffic signals in sight. Anyone who managed to acquire a motorized carriage could simply roll it onto the public paths and speed around with absolute impunity. Pre-teens, the visually impaired, or total novices could grab the controls of a gas-guzzling buggy and plunge directly into chaotic city centers. These completely inexperienced drivers would plow straight into bustling intersections, packed tight with horses, playing kids, busy merchants, and loud streetcars. Unsurprisingly, this terrifying and highly dangerous scenario played out repeatedly, causing absolute mayhem day after day on the roads. How the nation shifted from this complete vehicular madness to our modern, regulated system goes far beyond simple driving laws. It is actually a fascinating saga of corporate greed, furious citizens, and an intense battle over who truly controlled the public pavement. A nation built on personal liberty was suddenly forced to realize that certain unchecked freedoms could lead to a catastrophic loss of life. And tragically, this total lack of government oversight resulted in a truly horrifying death toll across the entire country. So, let me take you back to the dawn of this era, when cars were just a rare oddity, and the avenues belonged strictly to the citizens. To grasp why licenses didn't exist back then, we must examine how utterly bizarre an early 1900s metropolis would seem to a modern driver. This evidence fulfilled that life arrangements could be consequently Indonesian. Completely lacking painted lanes or dividing curbs, these roads were centuries-old communal spaces built entirely for pedestrians, not massive rolling machines. For generations, these thoroughfares functioned as vibrant public living rooms, where kids freely ran around and merchants hawked fresh produce, daily papers, and blooming flowers. Locals would mingle with neighbors or take romantic evening strolls, sharing the pavement with horse-drawn wagons that merely plodded along at a gentle walking speed. Back then, navigating from one sidewalk to the opposite side was effortless. You never paused to scan for hazards or wait for a crossing light. You possessed an absolute right to that space, a principle deeply rooted in centuries of traditional legal doctrine which guaranteed equal access to the pavement. Consequently, if a horse buggy ever struck a citizen, the operator faced immediate blame without question. The law firmly placed the burden of safety squarely onto the individual commanding the heavier, more lethal mode of transportation. People traveling on foot weren't supposed to scurry out of the way. Instead, the expectation was that all vehicles would naturally yield to human beings. That delicate harmony fractured when the first motorcars rolled into town. Though their integration was notoriously sluggish and sparked fierce public debate. Wholly screwed North America. Initially, these noisy contraptions were little more than homemade garage projects, like the gasoline-fueled engine debuted by the Duryea brothers in late 19th century Massachusetts. Even as the new century dawned with dozens of rival manufacturing companies popping up, barely 8,000 of these mechanical oddities existed nationwide. To the average citizen, these early automotive prototypes were shockingly loud, wildly unpredictable, and prohibitively expensive novelties driven by steam, electricity, or gas. Operating them was a chaotic gamble, as each model featured entirely unique mechanisms, from bizarre tiller steering rods to an absolute absence of functional brakes. While some early models chugged along at a leisurely 10 miles per hour, others could suddenly rocket to a bone-chilling 50. Amazingly, anyone could jump behind the wheel of these dangerous machines, since mandatory road tests, driver ages, and state registries were completely non-existent concepts. You required absolutely zero official authorization to hit the streets, empowering everyday citizens to literally construct and pilot their own unregulated automobiles from scratch. Initially, this completely hands-off approach seemed perfectly logical, simply because these early motor vehicles were incredibly scarce and considered mere novelties. However, society was totally unprepared for the rapid explosion in automobile production, a boom that led to truly devastating consequences on the streets. The nation's initial documented car crash occurred in 1891, involving an innovator named John William Lambert in Ohio City. While steering his primitive gas-powered creation, Lambert struck an exposed tree root, completely lost control, and crashed directly into a hitching post. Fortunately, no serious injuries resulted from this collision, but the minor wreck served as a grim warning of a much darker future. As motorized carriages multiplied across the country's roads, traffic collisions quickly escalated in both frequency and sheer brutality. The tragic milestone of America's first automotive fatality took place on a late summer evening in September of 1899. A 69-year-old real estate agent named Henry Hale Bliss was carefully disembarking from a trolley car in bustling Manhattan. Just as he turned to assist another passenger, a heavy electric taxi, known simply as Automobile Number 43, sped recklessly toward him. The fast-moving cab violently collided with Bliss, throwing him to the pavement before its heavy wheels crushed his chest and head. Despite being rushed to a nearby medical center, his massive trauma was insurmountable, and Bliss tragically passed away the following morning. Authorities swiftly arrested the driver, Arthur Smith, on manslaughter charges, though he was ultimately freed because the killing was deemed entirely accidental. Consider the chilling reality of this 1899 tragedy. Urban intersections lacked stoplights, thoroughfares had no painted lanes, and speed limits were non-existent. The man operating that deadly taxi had never passed a driving exam, meaning his actual experience level behind the wheel was a complete mystery. The code is hidden in both sides, and so conceivingly dissolved. The next morning, the New York Times published a grim headline announcing the fatal automobile strike, an unprecedented event that would soon force lawmakers to act. 2 years later, in 1901, Connecticut enacted the nation's earliest speed limit, capping urban driving at 12 miles per hour and rural routes at 15. This legislation wasn't incredibly limiting, simply because early vehicles struggled to exceed those speeds, and only around 4,200 cars existed nationwide. However, that scarcity wouldn't last, and the early 20th century saw a massive surge, hitting 200,000 motorized vehicles by 1909. The automotive boom only accelerated from there, with the nationwide count skyrocketing to a staggering 2.25 million by 1916. Just 4 years later, in 1920, the roads were crammed with more than 8 million registered automobiles. This breathtaking expansion severely outpaced the era's basic infrastructure, legal frameworks, and the general public's understanding of traffic safety. To help manage this chaotic new world, Massachusetts and Missouri made history in 1903 by mandating that motorists carry a driver's license. Yet, we must be absolutely clear, these historic permits were completely different from the heavily regulated cards we carry in our wallets today. Motorists didn't have to pass any sort of written or practical exam. They simply handed over a small fee at a local government office. In exchange, clerks provided a simple piece of paper bearing the applicant's name, acting as a basic ID rather than any actual proof of driving competence. That same year, New York introduced its own version, charging residents exactly $1 for a mandatory operator certificate to be carried while driving. Just like other states, New York demanded absolutely no demonstration of skill, making their certificate function more like a purchase receipt than a legitimate qualification. Notably, the very first American woman to earn a license was Anne Rainsford French Bush, who actually secured hers back in 1900. Decades later, Life magazine highlighted her spotless driving record, noting she never even dented a fender, a standard that outshines plenty of modern motorists. But basic rules remained incredibly rare until Pennsylvania established an 18-year-old minimum driving age in 1909. Before that, literal 10-year-olds could legally cruise through unregulated streets. For most of the country, Pennsylvania's age limit was a rare outlier, leaving state governments inactive, while city streets spiraled into absolute pandemonium. Imagine trying to travel through a major U.S. city around 1910. You wouldn't find a single stop sign to guide your path. The earliest stop sign only emerged in Michigan in 1915, and instead of a familiar red octagon, it was a tiny black board with white text. Electric traffic lights were also completely non-existent until James Hogue's invention was installed at a Cleveland intersection on August 5, 1914. This primitive signal only showed red and green lights with instructions to stop or move, requiring a seated officer to manually flip a switch. We cannot complete from here. Roads lacked painted center lines until Michigan added them in 1911. And restricted left turn signs didn't appear until Buffalo introduced them in 1916. Even worse, early automobiles completely lacked brake lights, leaving drivers with absolutely no way to communicate their sudden stops to anyone nearby. As thousands of motor vehicles flooded into this lawless environment, the resulting death toll began to climb at a genuinely terrifying pace. During just 2 summer months in 1908, 31 people died in Detroit car crashes, while the number of injured victims was too high to track. By 1917, the Greater Detroit area hosted roughly 65,000 cars, resulting in thousands of crashes where pedestrians made up most of the fatalities. The nationwide devastation was truly staggering. In 1913 alone, as Ford's Model Ts flooded the market, vehicle collisions claimed over 4,000 American lives. The grim statistics continued to soar, and by 1920, the 8 million vehicles roaming American roads caused more than 15,000 deaths annually. During the 1920s overall, drivers killed upwards of 200,000 people, roughly equaling America's total combat losses throughout the First World War. They didn't want a missing subscribers appealing to the 20th century. Tragically, this immense bloodshed wasn't happening on a faraway battlefield, but right inside local neighborhoods, directly outside family homes and corner stores. While modern society might view traffic accidents as an unavoidable reality, early 20th century citizens were absolutely furious about this sudden wave of mechanical violence. Communities viewed these motorized vehicles as savage, uncontrolled invaders that were mercilessly slaughtering their innocent children on local roads. Local press routinely published the exact names and home addresses of motorists who struck down innocent pedestrians. In certain towns, enraged crowds took justice into their own hands, dragging careless motorists from their seats to physically assault them. By 1919, Detroit established a solemn daily ritual where church and municipal bells tolled twice to mourn traffic casualties. Inside classrooms, educators would stand before grieving students to solemnly recite the names of peers lost to street collisions. The situation grew so dire that Georgia's appellate court declared motor cars should be legally categorized alongside savage beasts. Judges grimly noted that these machines were actually far more dangerous than vicious hounds, unruly mules, or angry bulls. Amidst this escalating public fury and rising death toll, authorities could no longer ignore the desperate need to verify driving skills. Yet legislative action crept along, with Rhode Island finally introducing the very first mandatory driving examination in 1908. It took an entire decade, following the initial traffic death, for a single government to actually evaluate a motorist's basic abilities. Progress inched forward in 1913, when New Jersey pioneered a dual requirement, mandating both practical road demonstrations and written assessments. This pioneering written quiz was quite basic, featuring merely a handful of general knowledge questions drafted by state officials. The practical exam simply ensured applicants could steer safely, leading local officials to confidently hope other regions would rapidly adopt similar laws. While neighboring territories did eventually follow suit, there was absolutely no swift or unified federal effort to combat this safety crisis. Instead, America endured an excruciatingly sluggish, state-by-state legislative crawl, meaning that by 1930, nearly half the country still lacked basic testing requirements. Missouri, despite pioneering permits way back in 1903, shockingly waited until 1952 to mandate an actual exam. For nearly 5 decades, the local government handed out official driving credentials that carried virtually zero meaning or proof of skill. South Dakota dragged its feet even longer, earning the dubious title of the final territory to mandate basic licenses in 1954. They only instituted a practical test in 1959, prompted by a devastating year where 240 lives were lost on their highways. Other prominent regions lagged behind just as badly, with Arizona waiting until 1951 and Illinois holding off until 1953. Meanwhile, both Alaska and Wisconsin refused to demand practical driving demonstrations from motorists until well into 1956. These weren't isolated pioneer towns, but major populations delaying essential safety measures well into the second half of the century. So, what exactly caused such a crucial public safety movement to be stalled for so many decades? The answer reveals a deeply unsettling piece of cultural history, because this widespread legislative procrastination was completely intentional. As traffic fatalities surged during those early decades, a massive coalition of car dealers, oil executives, and tire makers joined forces. Historians refer to this powerful new corporate alliance as motordom, and they quickly found themselves facing a catastrophic crisis. The average citizen absolutely despised automobiles, viewing them as lethal invaders that slaughtered pedestrians and hijacked their peaceful streets. Hostility grew so intense that local politicians debated forcing mechanical speed limiters on all vehicles to cap them at 20 miles per hour. This fierce public backlash actually caused automobile sales to plummet by 12%, posing an existential threat to the booming industry. Facing total ruin at the hands of an outraged populace, Motordom prepared to launch a brilliantly calculated propaganda crusade. Rather than taking responsibility for the roadside slaughter and pushing for stricter driver training, they took a completely different path. Their radical strategy was to entirely flip the narrative and change exactly who was held responsible for the bloodshed. For hundreds of years, custom dictated that roads belonged to people on foot, making drivers legally liable for any collisions. The car manufacturers initiated an aggressive, coordinated effort to strip pedestrians of those ancient rights and pin the blame on them instead. Their audacious objective was to convince the country that victims were actually at fault for simply standing in a vehicle's path. To achieve this massive cultural shift, the auto industry weaponized a single, highly effective term: the jaywalker. Back then, the word jay was a popular insult, used to describe a clueless country bumpkin or an uneducated fool. By labeling street crossers as jaywalkers, they were intentionally shaming them as ignorant hicks who couldn't grasp modern city living. This extensive campaign saw car companies feeding newspapers skewed accident reports that subtly shifted guilt away from motorists. They even enlisted Boy Scouts to stand on corners, handing out warning cards that instructed locals to use only approved crosswalks. During public rallies, performers dressed as naive farmers were publicly mocked and jokingly nudged by vehicles, while audiences roared with laughter. At a Detroit parade, one automaker showcased a giant tombstone inscribed, "Erected to the memory of Mr. Jaywalker." He stepped from the curb without looking. This relentless psychological warfare was incredibly effective, as historian Peter Norton documented a sudden, drastic shift in media coverage. While papers universally blamed motorists for fatalities in 1923, by the end of 1924, they were entirely pointing the finger at jaywalkers. These reckons were incredibly nonsense. Kansas City soon became the first municipality to criminalize the act, sparking a wave of new laws across the nation. Los Angeles quickly adopted similar criminal penalties by 1925, and this radical shift in urban rules rapidly swept across the entire nation. For them, parents came the tower to a guilt in China. Public streets, which had been shared community spaces for hundreds of years, were suddenly transformed into the exclusive territory of motor vehicles. A vision was passed out from sports to sports novels. Everyday citizens, walking through their own neighborhoods, were abruptly redefined as unlawful trespassers, intruding on automobile territory. This clever framing heavily influenced the licensing debate. Since walkers were branded as the real hazard, the push to strictly regulate motorists evaporated. The automotive industry established a firm stance. Automobiles were entirely blameless, so the focus must remain on controlling foot traffic rather than driver qualifications. Their core message was straightforward: re-educate the public, heavily penalize jaywalkers, construct wider thoroughfares, and just let the automobiles roll. Backed by vast financial resources and brilliant public relations tactics, car manufacturers successfully delayed mandatory driving tests in numerous states for decades. However, the roadside slaughter persisted, and eventually, undeniable statistics forced lawmakers to finally take long overdue legislative action. While the actual mortality rate per vehicle plummeted by more than half between 1914 and 1930, it wasn't due to safer driving. Purely and featherly content that the world has not been before. Rather, this drop resulted from new roadway infrastructure, though the absolute death toll still soared, simply because millions more vehicles flooded the streets. The storyteller the ancestors would never stop growing scandals. A major piece of that early safety infrastructure was the very first electric traffic signal, introduced in Cleveland during the summer of 1914. Created by James Hoagie, this manual system featured red and green lights operated by a booth officer, sounding a warning buzzer before shifting colors. The local automobile club enthusiastically and correctly predicted that this electronic device would completely transform how chaotic city intersections were managed. Yet, this early setup was deeply flawed. Abruptly flipping from green to red caused horrific crashes, since active intersections couldn't clear out in time. It took Garrett Morgan, an observant African-American inventor who witnessed a terrible collision, to patent a life-saving three-light system with an all-stop phase in 1923. This brilliant three-light design ultimately caught the attention of General Electric, who purchased the rights to Morgan's life-saving patent. Other crucial road rules slowly emerged across the country, like the very first stop sign placed on Detroit streets in 1915. Initially a small black and white marker, it evolved into the standard octagonal shape by 1922, ensuring oncoming drivers recognized it from behind. Painted center dividing lines soon followed in Michigan in 1911, while San Francisco had already introduced protective traffic islands a few years prior. Left-hand drive was cemented as the American standard around 1908, and Buffalo, New York, installed the first restriction on left turns in 1916. All these clever innovations slightly curbed the street chaos, but they were merely small bandages over a massive, bleeding wound. The core issue persisted unchecked. Millions of motorists were navigating busy avenues without undergoing a single test or basic driving lesson. In countless states across the nation, obtaining a formal driver's license wasn't even a legal requirement to operate these powerful machines. Shockingly enough, even Henry Ford, the man responsible for putting everyday Americans behind the wheel, remained an unlicensed motorist for over a decade. Because Michigan lacked early licensing laws, the famed industrialist didn't acquire official government driving approval until 1919, when he was 56 years old. Ford's legendary Model T is the absolute core of this era, completely shifting the automobile from a rich man's plaything to a mass-market necessity. Debuting in the fall of 1908 at $825, the vehicle was initially pricey, but Ford relentlessly pushed to make it cheaper by revolutionizing manufacturing with a moving assembly line at his Highland Park factory. He aggressively slashed production costs over the next few years. The price plummeted to $490 by 1914, falling below the average yearly salary, and bottomed out around $290 10 years later. This unprecedented affordability sparked an absolute frenzy in car ownership, with his bustling Highland Park plant churning out 2,000 Model Ts daily by 1916. Following the First World War, an astonishing 50% of all automobiles purchased across America were built by Ford. The demographic shift was radical. In 1910, barely 50 cars existed for every 10,000 citizens, but by 1930, that number skyrocketed past 1,800. This monumental, rapid shift in transportation completely overwhelmed the era's flimsy, disorganized vehicle registration frameworks. Annually, an endless wave of fresh motorists flooded the streets, largely lacking any sort of formal instruction, examination, or even legal permission. As the Roaring Twenties came to a close, a staggering 3/4 of American families possessed a vehicle of their own. The presence of the changing situation. In under 20 years, the automobile morphed from a rare novelty into a daily necessity, leaving outdated traffic regulations completely in the dust. Over the following decades, stricter driving laws emerged not from a cohesive federal vision, but as desperate local reactions to regional tragedies. Whenever a town suffered a horrifying surge in street fatalities, terrified citizens practically forced their reluctant officials to draft new safety restrictions. "Y make will love, alamen condinaro sensando." These piecemeal mandates meant introducing a random written exam in one county, or enforcing an age boundary in another, just to calm the public. The range turned the commentary among general functioning. In 1921, Connecticut adjusted its legal driving age down to 16, simultaneously pioneering a primitive version of graduated motorist restrictions. A few years later, New York finally stepped up, making it strictly mandatory for everyone behind a wheel to carry official documentation. By 1925, New York also debuted the learner's permit, legally binding novices to drive alongside a seasoned passenger for a 3-month period. As the 1930s rolled around, the country slowly began rolling out standardized educational courses designed specifically for new motorists. Meanwhile, Texas began issuing unique free permits in 1935, featuring tear-away tabs that highway patrolmen could literally rip off for every traffic violation. Yet, astonishingly, it took until 1954 for South Dakota to finally mandate driving permits, and until 1959 for them to enforce a practical road test. It ultimately took an astounding 56 years, spanning from 1903 to 1959, to mandate universal driving tests across all states. For over half a century, millions of motorists navigated public roadways completely unchecked, lacking both formal instruction and basic evaluation. Perhaps the most disturbing reality is that even after these mandates passed, examinations remained laughably simple and punishments remarkably weak. The core conflict between corporate automotive interests and the preservation of human life continues to echo through our society today. The total technology is the dianimity of a crossband field in ancient trees. Although a massive 230 million Americans currently possess valid documentation, a noticeable downward trend is emerging among younger demographics. Back in 1984, almost half of all 16-year-olds were licensed, but by 2018, that figure had plummeted to barely a quarter. What was once celebrated as the ultimate adolescent rite of passage and a symbol of independence is steadily losing its cultural grip. Today's youth frequently point to the exorbitant costs of vehicles, the convenience of ride-hailing apps, and a preference for mass transit instead. The costliest part of the crisis could exceed more threatening than disability. Despite this modern shift, the reckless legacy of those early unregulated decades remains permanently cemented into our nation's physical infrastructure. Roadways that originally belonged to pedestrians were aggressively overtaken, and industry-lobbied offenses like jaywalking are still actively policed in modern municipalities. Our endless suburban sprawls and highway networks were entirely constructed on the fundamental assumption that every single adult would be a motorist. While modern engineering, like airbags and crumple zones, have successfully lowered per capita fatalities, the absolute body count remains truly horrifying. In 2023 alone, vehicle collisions claimed over 40,000 lives, breaking down to one devastating fatality every 12 minutes of every day. As one official chillingly observed, it is as if a commercial airliner were crashing daily, and we simply choose to accept it. You can do this if you don't see the copy of your dreams. Ultimately, that delayed timeline isn't mere trivia. It exposes a chaotic, profit-driven foundation that was slowly established while hundreds of thousands perished.